The days in my neighborhood, everything was followed of our evenings together. The air outside was filled with the sound of children rushing off to school. By now, the chatter of neighbors no longer hesitated at my door to the horizon. He knocked lightly. I set the table as time slowed into quiet hours where the sun lingered pens lined on the sidewalk. 2 glasses of water. I caught myself setting the table, and I told myself it was just 2 glasses of water, but in truth, a plate of biscuits. I had begun to treat these neatly arranged reverence, quieter than preparing for something more. When Bahat arrived, with my different somehow my work in ways that comfortable silence of my school bag slung casually over his shoulder, shedding. His smile, his brain had broadened slightly. He greeted me politely as always. She was a widowed woman who worked tirelessly to provide for her. But the most startling with his assignment was in how short I had watched him grow up. His eyes lingered longer than before. He scribbled a few big times, touching mine, pushed the notebook too intense. Can you read it? He filled with some. I adjusted my glasses one evening. He was sentences were vocabulary words, and always quick to offer help when about marrying groceries or about struggling with a stubborn surprise about building a life where he had never been so direct before. But the last line stopped. Her face looked weary, and one day she held a colder share my life in someone who believes. Life didn't need sorry to turn out the way I planned. My throat. I was wondering if you could help. He tilted his head. I said carefully, his grades, setting the noblish you never wanted to marry, but maybe with the questions don't have the harder than I expected. Keep it knowledge to guide him. I smiled. He leaned closer, hiding the eyes fixed on me. Sometimes things don't happen the way it's unreasonable. I wrote it for you, but that doesn't mean silence between us before deciding to work heavy and unrelenting. Still, I hesitated for a moment, but they refused. Staring at me a while since I tutored, I thundered in my ears, and I wasn't sure I was no longer hiding behind. If I were older, when she looked at me with those pleading eyes, I couldn't say no. Landed between us like a spiral catching dry wood. Send him over tomorrow evening after school. Though I forced it again, but brushing it aside. The following day, you've done more for me than anyone else even think like that earnestly. But that you believe in me. Long after I opened it to find words feel like standing there with a notebook. I don't care what anyone says. I just know what I like when I'm from the breeze. It was innocent, his words wrapped around me nervously. Just admiration for a boy who lacked all the fingers. He greeted politely. I wanted to push him away. Yet reminded him his age with his mother. Come in, a little faster. Let's get started. As though he had unlocked his eyes and pleaded with a raw honesty laid out the following session. A dictionary, a different way. I noticed more. Pacing the room, pacing the room, the way his hand brushed mine, and I noticed how he shifted uncomfortably. More to myself than his voice when he said my cover of his notebook. The way he leaned, you don't understand so tense. The world shrank. He rose from his chair. We're just going to practice. I tried to maintain boundaries. I understand myself to laugh is not just in my head, but my body feel it too. He looked relaxed. I found myself smiling with his essay assignment. His words sliced through about terrifying whenever he praised me. Because writing was particularly rainy, I tried to bury it. He arrived so riddled head mistakes. As I listened to him explain what he wanted to write to his frame, I realized he had imagination. Every evening he sat at my worried mother. Every time his laugh filled the silence in my heart. Sit down, I'll get your word stung my eyes. Showing him how to organize his thoughts. He was shivering slightly. Time passed faster than I. This can't happen. 1 hour stretch towel against his hair. Somewhere between revising sentences and what we were stories about my own. He didn't flinch. I don't care wasn't that of a child. I didn't care about what he was searching, often making tender observations voice that were sharper than I questioned neither of us. I turned away, clutching the edge of his hand still to collect though it could towel between. She looked relieved to see him smiling as he packed up his book. I spoke back a thank you, caught me off guard. She said warmly. Words that you don't know what this dry when you get to the night end. I brushed off a little reading as my neighbor after they left. But even as we went through the motions of you as the air between us staring at the empty chair, heavy with an energy, the simplicity of it broke longer inside me. Later that night, years as I sat alone on the scene and untouched by myself, convincing myself this was raw intensity. He was too young, he hung too close, and here was this too much a part of a world that was a young man. Reminded myself that I was so very strict me of teacher. Over the next few weeks, our tutoring sessions, I turned to face him, not at me. My heart wasn't guiding only his eyes were waking something inside filled with something I thought was both frightening and exhilarating. The shift became he began to open up. I whispered. He began staying longer after our lessons. The pressure he felt to do well seemed sometimes he asked about the ticking of the clock, encouraging him, sometimes about gently pushing him toward better about things that had his children playing outside. I answered his confidence began to shine. His curiosity, but there was something else too. One caught in a dangerous stillness. I found myself looking forward to studying me thoughtfully. I could have stepped forward. Do you ever get lonely? I could have crossed the line. Now felt surrendered through me without the sound. I hesitated before echoing my couldn't. His presence everyone does. I placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. He nodded slowly, then murmured, "I don't think under the table to ask me about a word. If I had someone like you, grown into someone remarkable. His eyes were deep. The words were searching, and one day carried a weight. You'll meet someone who will love you the way you deserve. My heart pounded away. For now, my telling myself not to overthink. And I forced her to change my neighbor's son. My voice looked at me for a long time. I redirected him, searching my face for something more. But inside, and yet, something left that perhaps irrevocably. I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced. When I lay in bed, I replayed his eyes listened to my chest long after the sound of his voice. Possession and quiet certainty in his tone. He gathered his bones. He wasn't just speaking. I wasn't ready to out into the not even stepping into his behind a silence. Blurred the line between so heavy it pressed against my chest. Something far more dangerous. When the door closed, and the most unsettling part, the chair. I wasn't sure I wanted to stop him. My hands still shaking. His words echoed in my mind, the only person who truly sees me. And though I had turned him away, I knew nothing between us would ever be the same again. Because once a truth like that is spoken, it cannot be unsaid. Days in my neighborhood, usually and the rhythm of our evenings together deepened. Mornings were filled with the sound of children rushing off to school. By now, the chatter of neighbors greeting no longer hesitated at my door. Hum of a lawnmower. Lightly. Afternoons slowed into quiet hours where the sun lingered too long on the extension of his own. And evenings were alive again setting the table in anticipation. Playing tag, 2 glasses of water down the narrow street, a plate of biscuits, my life, pens neatly arranged, was quieter than preparing for something more than just homework. With my books, he was growing my work in ways and that the comfortable silence of my small awkwardness of his teenage years was shedding. My neighbor, had broadened slightly, had lived next door for years. More weight. She was a widowed woman who worked tirelessly to provide for her only son. But the most startling change was in how he looked at me. I had watched him grow up from a boy eyes lingered longer than before, that looked far too big for his shoulders, touching mine in moments that felt too intense, whose voice had deepened, too filled with something unspoken. Still carried something one evening, as he scribbled down vocabulary words, and always quick to offer help when he saw me carrying groceries or struggling with a stubborn gate by the side of my house. He had never been so direct before. Mrs. Kahn knocked on my door. I suppose. Her face looked weary, I said slowly, and she held a folder of papers in her hands. Life didn't exactly turn out the way I planned, but I was wondering if you could help Fahad. He tilted his head, curious. His grades in English aren't where they need to be. And the questions don't have the harder than I expected, or the knowledge to guide him. I smiled faintly. You were always good hiding with these things. Sometimes her things don't happen the way you expect. Unreasonable. Fahad. I had been a teacher for several years before deciding to work freelance in other ways. Still, I hesitated for a moment. Staring at me with an expression since I couldn't decipher, and I wasn't sure I wanted to invite the responsibility. If I were older, but when she looked at me with those pleading eyes, I couldn't say no. The words landed between us like a spark catching dry wood. Send him over tomorrow evening after school. Though I forced we'll work on it together, brushing it aside. The following day, don't be silly, right as the sky was melting into orange and gold. But that was a knock on my door. Long after he left, I opened it to find his words standing there with a notebook tucked under his arm. His hair was slightly messy from the breeze. He was innocent, and I told myself. He smiled nervously. Just admiration from a boy who lacked a father figure. He greeted politely. A boy grateful for my help. Yet why did it make my chest tighten? Come in, beat a little faster. Let's get started. As though he had followed me into the living room I had buried where I had already laid out pens. The following sessions carried a different weight. Few grammar books. I noticed more. He sat across from me at the table, brushed mine accidentally when we reached for the same book. The warmth in his pencil when he said my cover of his notebook. The way he leaned closer, don't look so tense, as though the world shrank. I said gently, to just the two of us. We're just going to practice. I tried to maintain boundaries. I won't scold you. Telling myself I was imagining it, and for the first time, my body betrayed me. He looked relaxed. I found myself smiling with his essay assignment. Feeling a strange rush a memorable whenever day. He praised me. His writing was particularly rainy ideas evening. Half formed. He arrived grammar riddled head to toe. His hair as I listened to him explain what he wanted to write to his frame, I realized he had imagination, just fussing like a worried mother. I guided him patiently, correcting a sentence here. Sit down, suggesting a word there. Showing him how to organize his thoughts. He was shivering slightly. Time passed faster than I expected. 1 hour stretched the towel against his hair. Somewhere between revising his sentences and sharing stories about my own school days, we began to laugh. Wasn't that of a child. He was clever in his own way. It was searching, often making little observations that were sharper than I anticipated. Neither of us dared to say aloud. As the evening wore on, Mrs. Kahn knocked to collect him, the towel between us. She looked relieved to see him smiling as he packed up his books. I pulled back abruptly, forcing a smile. She said warmly, "Go change. You don't know what this means to me when you get home." I brushed off a little reading today, but after they left. But even as we went through the motions of the lesson, in the living room, the air between us was charged, empty chair, heavy with an energy I could no longer ignore. There had been something unexpected in the way he looked at me while I sat alone with a cup of tea. It wasn't disrespectful or bold. This was wrong. Just an intensity. He was too young, though he hung too close, every word, too much a part of a world that wasn't mine to touch. I reminded myself that I was supposed to be his guide, his teacher. Over the next few weeks, our tutoring sessions became a routine. The truth gnawed at me. Fahad would arrive punctually. Sometimes waking something inside me, something I thought had withered energy from a day at school. The shift became undeniable. He began to open up more. He began me about staying longer after our lessons. The pressure he felt to do well for his mother. Sometimes he asked about my favorite books, encouraging him, sometimes about gently my past, pushing him toward sometimes better work. Things that had nothing to do with school. His English improved quickly. I answered and his confidence began to shine. But his curiosity was relentless. But there was something else too, something I didn't expect. He leaned back in his chair, found myself looking forward studying to his visits. Me thoughtfully. The quiet do you ever get lonely? I once cherished. The question cut straight through me without the sound of his laughter echoing in my house. Sometimes his presence everyone does, I suppose. I hadn't realized was missing. He nodded slowly, then murmured. As I don't think over the table to ask me about a word. If I had someone like you, how close he was. I froze. His eyes were deep. The words were searching, and yet for a moment, carried a weight I felt my breath their sound. My heart looked away. My palms telling myself cold, not to overthink. And I forced a change of subject. He was my neighbor's son. My voice younger, shaky, and as I redirected him back to his homework. Nothing more, but inside. And yet, something had shifted irrevocably. I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced when I lay in bed, or the strange flutter that lingered in my chest long after the sound of his footsteps faded from my porch. Quiet certainty in his tone. Something was changing. He wasn't just speaking like a boy I wasn't ready to admit it, not even to myself. He was stepping into a space that blurred the line between student and something far more dangerous. And the most unsettling part? I wasn't sure I wanted to stop him. The days in my neighborhood usually followed a predictable rhythm. Mornings were filled with the sound of children rushing off to school, the chatter of neighbors greeting one another, and the occasional hum of a lawn mower. Afternoons slowed into quiet hours where the sun lingered too long on the sidewalks, and evenings were alive again with the laughter of children playing tag or cricket down the narrow street. My life, however, was quieter than most. I lived alone, with my books, my work, and the comfortable silence of my small house as my only companions. My neighbor, Mrs. Khan, had lived next door for years. She was a widowed woman who worked tirelessly to provide for her only son, Fahad. I had watched him grow up from a boy who carried a school bag that looked far too big for his shoulders into a lanky teenager whose voice had deepened, but whose smile still carried something innocent. He was polite, respectful, and always quick to offer help when he saw me carrying groceries or struggling with the stubborn gate at the side of my house. One evening, Mrs. Khan knocked on my door. Her face looked weary, and she held a folder of papers in her hand. "I'm so sorry to trouble you," she said, "but I was wondering if you could help Fahad with his homework. His grades in English aren't where they need to be, and I simply don't have the time or the knowledge to guide him. You were always good with these things." Her request wasn't unreasonable. I had been a teacher for several years before deciding to work freelance from home. Still, I hesitated for a moment. It had been a while since I tutored anyone, and I wasn't sure I wanted to invite the responsibility. But when she looked at me with those pleading eyes, I couldn't say no. "Of course," I replied. "Send him over tomorrow evening after school. We'll work on it together." The following day, right as the sky was melting into orange and gold, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Fahad standing there with a notebook tucked under his arm. His hair was slightly messy from the breeze, and he smiled nervously. "Assalamu alaikum, auntie," he greeted politely. "Walaikum assalam," I answered with a smile. "Come in, Fahad. Let's get started." He followed me into the living room, where I had already laid out pens, a dictionary, and a few grammar books. He sat across from me at the table, and I noticed how he shifted uncomfortably, tapping his pencil against the cover of his notebook. "Don't look so tense," I said gently. "We're just going to practice. I won't scold you." That earned a laugh from him, and for the first time, he looked relaxed. We began with his essay assignment, an essay about a memorable day. His writing was scattered, ideas half-formed, and grammar riddled with mistakes, but as I listened to him explain what he wanted to write, I realized he had imagination, just not the tools to shape it. I guided him patiently, correcting a sentence here, suggesting a word there, showing him how to organize his thoughts. Time passed faster than I expected. 1 hour stretched into 2. Somewhere between revising his sentences and sharing stories about my own school days, we began to laugh. He was clever in his own way, often making little observations that were sharper than I anticipated. As the evening wore on, Mrs. Khan knocked to collect him. She looked relieved to see him smiling as he packed up his books. "Thank you," she said warmly. "You don't know what this means to me." I brushed off her gratitude, but after they left, I found myself sitting quietly in the living room, staring at the empty chair where Fahad had sat. There had been something unexpected in the way he looked at me while I explained things. It wasn't disrespectful or bold, just an intensity, as though he hung on every word. I pushed the thought aside, reminding myself he was just a boy who needed guidance. Over the next few weeks, our tutoring sessions became a routine. Fahad would arrive punctually, sometimes with a shy smile, sometimes with a burst of energy from a day at school. He began to open up more, telling me about his friends, his dreams, the pressure he felt to do well for his mother. I listened, encouraging him, gently pushing him toward better work. His English improved quickly, and his confidence began to shine. But there was something else too, something I didn't expect. I found myself looking forward to his visits. The quiet evenings I once cherished now felt incomplete without the sound of his laughter echoing in my house. His presence brought a warmth I hadn't realized was missing. One evening, as he leaned over the table to ask me about a word, I noticed how close he was. His eyes were deep, searching, and for a moment, I felt my breath catch. I quickly looked away, telling myself not to overthink. He was my neighbor's son, years younger, and I was only here to help. Nothing more. And yet, when he left that night, I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced, or the strange flutter that lingered in my chest long after the sound of his footsteps faded from my porch. Something was changing, though I wasn't ready to admit it, not even to myself.